Okay, it's 3 minutes past, so I'm going to get us started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mariana Pauli from Christian Aid, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all in this webinar, The International Financial Architecture and Climate Finance at COP30, What to Expect. This is an initiative of the Debt and Climate Working Group, which is open to many members of civil society, activists, movements, and academics interested in the intersection between that and the climate crisis, including addressing the barriers for climate action, climate finance, debt, fossil fuels, and just transitions. It is an initiative coordinated by Aphrodite, APMDD, CAN, Debt for Climate, Debt Justice UK, Demand Climate Justice, Eurodat, Latin Debt, Recourse, and the Climate Community Institute. And it's really critical we're having this conversation today because COP30 is just around the corner. We know that the UN climate talks are happening under really turbulent geopolitical times, trade wars, aid cuts, and are influenced by the global financial decisions that are happening in other global processes and institutions. And we know that climate finance is really key to secure progress in all areas of climate action and within the negotiations, and especially reclaiming the role of public finance at scale to deliver climate justice, to meet the needs of global south communities is essential. We know that developed countries must provide their fair share of climate finance, not only because they're mandated by the Climate Paris Agreement, but because it's a matter of equity, justice, and common but different responsibilities. We also know that it's key to connect climate finance conversation with the wider processes, especially because it's not in isolation. We are under multiple crises, increasing poverty and inequality in a limited fiscal space due to the debt crisis and tax dodging. So as you see, the international financial system is not fit for purpose, and it has direct impacts on the quality, the quantity of climate finance, but also how it is delivered and by whom. So in this webinar today, we really want to take stock on how those key non-UNFCCC forums and processes that are relevant for the international financial architecture can have a direct impact in the COP politics and outcomes. Global climate finance is addressed through the different political processes. They are very intertwined. So we want to see COP30 through the lenses of the politics and outcomes of these other four key forums, underscoring the climate and debt nexus and connecting the dots between international financial institutions, reform and climate finance. So I have the pleasure today to be joined by Daniela Verdeja Ruiz from Latin Debt, who will share her perspectives on the outcomes of FFD, the Finance for Development 4 conference that happened in Seville in July. We're also going to hear from John Swerd from the Bretton Woods Project, who will share perspectives around the World Bank and IMF annuals that just happened a few weeks ago in DC. We'll also be looking at two upcoming processes, the UN Tax Convention negotiations that are happening in November, and Mark Australian from Eurodat will share. We also have, just around the corner after COP, in the very end tail of COP, the G20 in South Africa, where debt is a big part of the conversation. And Yolanda Fresnillo from Eurodat will share as well. And then where this is all connect is around COP30, and for that we'll have Rebecca Thyssen from CAN. So thank you all so much for being here. I would like to start inviting Daniela to share how climate as a cross-cutting theme on FFD4, to what extent the outcomes impact the climate finance agenda and COP. Daniela, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and thank you to the Debt and Climate Working Group for organizing this webinar. Yes, definitely, climate was or is a cross-cutting issue, but I think there is a difference in the understanding between the civil society and climate and economic justice movements. on the interlinkages on finance, climate, and the needs and why a reform or a systemic reform is needed, and the views of the governments and decision makers. So I think that's why when we see the outcome document of the Financing for Development conference, we find, yes, climate, environmental issues throughout the text, but in an incomplete and narrow way. What I mean with this, there is climate language, but it is not translated into actionable steps or greater efforts or on commitments. So I think that's why I was starting highlighting this difference in the understanding. So ambition was diluted throughout the FFD process, not only looking at the outcome document, but also if we see how it began and how it ended. And so I would like to highlight here a general issue that I think is also important for other spaces, other processes that are going on that I think is part of the discussion today. And I believe that first we have to acknowledge the fact that having held the fourth FFD conference was in itself a gesture of willingness to strengthen multilateralism. We also need to recognize the push and the work that civil society put on this conference. But in the process, we see that there was a strong opposition to any way out of the current status quo, mainly from northern countries. And at the same time, we see that there were southern voices that put forward progressive proposals for change, but were not really heard. So at this time, we need to also remember that this system, the current system, was designed by few more than 80 years ago. So this didn't respond to the current world we have today. And I think that this need for a renewed multilateralism is one of the biggest challenges, not only following the FFD process, but thinking on COP and other spaces. So we need a multilateralism where all voices count. So I would like now, I know I don't have enough time to talk about all the issues of the FFD. I would like to focus a little bit more on the debt chapter. I believe people that join us today are pretty familiar with the interlinkages of the debt crisis and climate crisis. But thinking on, and of course, we have these interlinkages can be solved through a systemic reform that could address simultaneously both problems, but also other development needs, human rights, inclusion into the economic system, and others. But first, I would like to say what are the main problems I find in the debt system. There are many, but I will point out three. The first one is we are facing an undemocratic governance where decision-making spaces are dominated by lenders, including the IMF and the World Bank. And the second one is the lack of a unified, coordinated system set of clear rules to address debt problems and crises. There are no legal frameworks to deal with that, and all the responses end up being reactive rather than preventive. And they are given on an ad hoc basis. I mean, depending on the situation of each case, they find out how to respond. So it's messy. And the third one is that the responsibility and cost fall solely on the borrowing countries, while ignoring the structural deficiencies that we find in the global system. So on top of that, what we have today that I want to highlight, thinking also on COP, is a big push for these so-called quote-unquote innovative financial instruments, which from their point of view address both problems, climate and debt, but such as, for instance, debt for climate or debt for nature swaps. But in the end, they didn't solve debt problems, they didn't solve climate or environmental needs. So for the work we do, there are no other thing that false solutions that in a way they are destructive to avoid addressing systemic change. and we need to demystify these impacts of the or usefulness of these instruments. With that said, the civil society and debt justice movements have a very long-standing demands. And towards this FFD process, we try to put them together in a comprehensive way. And that's where the idea of pushing and calling for a framework convention on sovereign debt at the UN came to the table, and it was supported vocally from the southern countries during the FFD. I can mention some of them, but AOSIS, that is the group of small islands and development, small and development islands, African group, Pakistan, Egypt, Brazil, Cuba. They pushed that during the negotiations, but in the end, we didn't achieve that. Why this convention? Because this convention should encompass a global consensus or on a democratic way, that's why the UN, on the necessary rules, principles, and structures for a fairer debt architecture. So I thought that this was not achieved. We cannot lose momentum. And now I would like I know I have 1 minute to just mention what was not achieved and what was achieved during this FFD regarding that. Okay, we didn't achieve the UN Convention. We didn't achieve to reduce the power of IFIs, Paris Club in the debt governance. We didn't find a truly independent, fair, and democratic mechanism to address debt crisis, including debt relief needs. And we didn't reform the credit rating agencies. We didn't achieve steps forwards to a reform of these agencies. And of course, as I was saying, we didn't find a way to demystify the scale and impacts of debt swaps. That's why they are in the outcome document. They are pushing for that. And I think that will be part of the discussions during COP. What we achieved, I have many points, but I would perhaps try to end up with a positive idea. And they agreed to start an intergovernmental process at the UN with a view to reform the debt architecture. So I think that could open a little window of opportunity to continue pushing for this debt convention that at the end would guarantee a fairer system from a perspective of justice, not only economic, but also climate and social and gender justice. So I want to highlight that. I don't know if I have enough time to continue with other things, but I am happy to share with them during the conversation. Just ending up that saying that we need to continue advocating for real change. We are in a highly challenging context, mainly for those of us who are advocating for that. So just with that message, I would like to end my first intervention. Thank you, Mariana.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And I think indeed some of the challenges you have highlighted are present throughout the conversation in other spaces. And I think this is a really good segue now for us to think through. We had FFD and then the World Bank and IMF annuals just after, which of course would take into consideration the outcomes of FD4 as well. But thinking about the climate question, actually the World Bank was a lot quieter than usual in the climate agenda during the annual. So to some extent, it's a bit of a contradiction of the role of within the climate process that the Bretton Woods institutions and MDBs have been playing or been wanting to see to be playing. So, John, how does the annual outcomes on debt and climate finance agenda affect the negotiations at COP30? Can you share with us more what happened there? Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. I will try to, if I can manage to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. My name is John Sword. I'm with the Bretton Woods Project. We are a UK-based World Bank and IMF watchdog. And sort of double apologies from me. Number one, I have to leave after 30 minutes, so I'll miss most of the discussion, but very happy to follow up via email. And number two, I have a little bit of a cold that I'm going to try to push through here. So that's already two strikes against me on the sort of the webinar scorecard here. Yeah, maybe to give a little bit of background in terms of the Bretton Woods institutions, in other words, the World Bank and the IMF, and their growing relevance to the wider sort of climate finance and climate action architecture and landscape. So I think what those of us who've been following the sort of climate work of the World Bank and other MDBs in recent years have witnessed is a really stark growth in reported climate finance at these institutions. And indeed, after the negotiations around a new global climate finance goal at COP last year, the MDBs sort of emerged as this de facto pillar of the new public financing target. And you can see on this slide that's presented here, they now have a collective commitment to provide 120 billion US dollars in climate finance to low and middle income countries by 2030. At the World Bank, we've seen their reported climate finance figures increase pretty dramatically earlier this decade, going from around 25 billion to 45 billion over a 4-year span. And I guess from the point of view of this webinar and the sort of broader climate finance debate, when you're funneling climate finance through the MDBs, you really run into tensions with the polluter pays principle in particular. So most of this is loan-based financing. Obviously, a lot of that is concessional compared to market rates, but only a small proportion of what the World Bank, for example, provides is grant-based. And also the sort of operational model of the MDBs is quite reliant on low and middle income countries repaying loans with interest, right? And I think more broadly, there's questions around transparency and greenwashing as these figures have grown substantially. But beyond this sort of narrow lens of climate finance, there's also a number of ways in which the World Bank and IMF have become increasingly relevant to what happens at COP. So taking a big step back, the World Bank is the largest MDB lender to low and middle income countries. The IMF is sort of their chief lender of last resort. And so both are playing an extremely important normative role in terms of economic policy norms, broadly speaking. The World Bank and other MDBs are also in the process of aligning their entire portfolios with the Paris Agreement related to Article 2.1c. And so that screening process is having an important normative kind of set of implications around what is considered Paris aligned in terms of financing and practices. The IMF from 2021, after a sort of very long and tortured debate in its board, agreed that various dimensions of climate change are relevant to its mandate to ensure macro stability. And so since 2021, that's creeped into the different buckets of the IMF's mandate, including its surveillance function. And also in 2022, it established a new Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which has a mandate to help assist members with future balance of payments issues related to climate change via providing concessional loans. And I think lastly, an important thing to note, and of course, this is the sort of one of the big themes of COP30, is despite the sort of struggles of actually mobilizing private finance since the launch of the billions to trillions approach in 2017 at the World Bank, Both institutions have been extremely vocal supporters of mobilizing private climate finance via de-risking green projects, but also through creating sort of green private capital mobilization. And so to just touch on a few things that came out of the annual meetings, which were earlier this month in Washington, D.C., one thing we've seen throughout the year is in public anyway, both institutions going relatively silent on climate in an apparent effort to not try to get into the sort of political target line of the Trump administration. So, for example, in terms of the official schedules at the annual meetings for the World Bank and IMF, there were really no high-level events on climate at all, which is a huge departure from the sort of past 4 or 5 years. So obviously, this context creates a sort of risk of backsliding in terms of the bank and fund's own internal climate work. And also, I think, temporarily weakens their ability to act as conveners and norm shapers on climate if they're not speaking about it as much in public. There's been a lot of reporting about the US administration trying to get the MDBs to finance fossil fuels to a greater extent. So as a result of this, which I think is a very live discussion, there is some question about whether the kind of rules foreseeing gas power in particular as being assessed as Paris aligned could be loosened a bit. But I think there's also a sort of strong, less vocal majority on the executive boards that want to see climate work remaining relatively core to both institutions. So there's quite a bit of tension around the issue at the moment. I think a few things to watch out for are up to under previous climate finance accounting rules, MDB's climate finance was only counted as part of the 100 billion target in terms of the amount that could be linked back to rich countries paid in capital at the MDBs. And now I think there's a discussion underway around whether all of that MDB's climate finance would be counted towards a future goal. And so that's a sort of wonky issue to maybe pay attention to as this and other COPs progress. There's also meant to be a sort of some announcement around an online MDB's climate finance dashboard or database at COP30. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how vocal the World Bank and other MDBs are at COP compared to recent years. Of course, I think, as already mentioned, both the bank and fund is sort of handmaidens of this new era of green conditionality in terms of IMF programs and what we've seen come through the RST and World Bank policy-based lending, which is also called development policy financing. A lot of this has been focused on creating an enabling environment in energy and other sectors in order for those to become asset classes or just investable in terms of private investors. And so I think there's implications for this COP in terms of the just transition work in particular. In our research, we've seen a lot of that reform agenda leading to higher costs for end users in the South, and sometimes unintended fiscal implications of take or pay contracts in the energy sector, for example. I think there's also a huge question over the future of the IMF's role on climate. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva had been really vocal about climate change in her first term as MD, and she's been extremely quiet on the issue. And there's also rumors that over the next few years, the RST could just simply be wound down after the existing sort of projects or programs that have already been agreed kind of wind themselves down. So yeah, I expect a much smaller kind of footprint for certainly her and the IMF at COP30. I think I'll pause there. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, John, so much for sharing those perspectives. I guess it's really interesting how actually the many of us who have been so critic of the fund and the bank for so many years, of doing more harm than good, and giving their limitations, as you just highlighted, in terms of their role within climate. I'm also curious to see how we can make the most of that agenda within the conversations around COP, exactly because it's both what you said and Danielle also mentioned in terms of their, innovative solutions, their role in terms of how, in which ways their approaches in terms of private sector first, private finance, and how this will be dealt with at COP. But in the same way that when we look about the international financial architecture, we're discussing about the correlation between that and climate, but we also, global South countries suffer from limited fiscal space, also due to the tax dodging practice and conversations. And for that, it's great that we have the ongoing UN tax convention negotiations, which actually will happen at the same time as COP30. And it's really important for us to connect the dots between those two agendas. And for that, it would be great to hear from Marcus on that. Marcus, over to you. Thank you for coming.
Mariana, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon. Marcus Kling, my name. I'm in the tax team of Eurodebt. And indeed, you said it. Now we're looking at taxation as a big potential to create fiscal space. At the same time, the current tax rules are kind of a structural barrier to fully unleash the potential. So I would like quickly talk you through what is at stake, how it really relates, COP30, UN Tax Convention negotiations, and concretely, what is at stake, what are we going to do? So just to set the scene and to make the connection, Wednesday's NDC report again nailed it down that parties facing finance-related challenges and limitations, in particular debt burden, clearly, and limited fiscal space. And this is the codification, the code word for the tax world. There is an issue with public revenues, tax income. And the colleagues from the Tax Justice Network give it a price tag. It is around $500 billion every year that the public purse is losing out by tax evasion, tax avoidance, aggressive tax planning, it's called, by companies, or the ultra-rich hiding their assets. So this is the money, 500 billion, which could be collected by administration. And the case is particularly strong for global South countries who relatively lose more on foregone tax revenues than other countries, the rich countries. So I think the most actual figure we have here is from ATAF, 60 to 90 billion lost in illicit financial flows. This is not only taxation, other figures. So again, it's always difficult to be very precise because you actually don't know what is hidden and what is shifted. But the numbers are significant and they could make a difference when we're thinking about fiscal space, sustainable development, and climate finance. So again, the creating fiscal space is here as well. This is my understanding that the mandate for the Baku to Belém roadmap. It should include measures to create fiscal space, taking into account relevant multilateral initiatives as appropriate. And there we are now. Most of the world is negotiating a United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. Mariana mentioned it. We are relatively at the beginning of the negotiations, and 2 weeks' time, COP30 and those negotiations in Nairobi on the tax convention happen in parallel. The overall ambition of this tax convention negotiations indeed is to have an overall of the current tax system, of the tax rules, to establish an inclusive, fair, transparent, efficient, equitable, effective tax system for sustainable development. This is important. And with the ultimate goal as well, to strengthening domestic resource mobilization, meaning having more public revenues, more public resources for climate action, among others. And there is, apart from the general potential to get more money in from tax revenues, there's a particular element which is very interesting for us, because you see here quotes from the terms of reference. So the overall menu or objectives and setup. And here it says that the international tax rules have to take a holistic approach, including environmental policy elements. And then further on, that sustainable development has to be core of it. And it's 3 dimensions: environmental, economic, and social, in a balanced and integrated manner. So far, this was a good starting point. A week ago, we got the first draft of this framework convention, including an article on sustainable development. And here we see that it is hardly going beyond the terms of reference. It's hardly being more concrete or even actionable than the mandate given to the tax convention. And there were very few negotiators who as well were complaining about this. So when we are now going to Nairobi next week, again, apart from the overall ambition of the tax convention to overhaul the rules, to get more money in for the public purse, in particular when it comes to the sustainable development article, we want to see this further developed by including a subcommitment on progressive environmental taxation, adding the polluter pays principle and the common but differentiated responsibilities in it, and then on our wish list as well, and we are pushing for this, to derive out of the process innovative sources of financing. In our case, a fossil fuel profit surtax. So again, global fossil fuel companies should pay an extra tax on their profits, and this then should be channeled into international climate finance as a direct contribution to climate financing. And for COP30, we would wish that, I'm saying this because in the tax convention negotiators are excellent tax experts, but they deem to ignore all other policy and politic dimension which sustainable development brings with us. So we hope that from Belém there can come a push over the ocean to Nairobi, to the finance ministers, to the negotiators, that recognizes that this tax convention is relevant for mobilizing public finance, for climate financing in particularly. So again, we hope the COP30 would acknowledge that there is a tax convention going on, that this is relevant for creating fiscal space, and there are certain structural barriers within the UNFCCC context, which have to be addressed. And then again, we are ending up with a main task of a tax convention to stop illicit financial flows, to stop tax avoidance and tax evasion, to close tax havens, to tax high net worth individuals, to end financial secrecy, to redistribute taxing rights, and to make polluters pay. And we would hope that in one or the other way, this recognition of the UN Tax Convention as a barrier for climate finance to make it into the Baku to Belém roadmap or any decision on Article 2.c, for example. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for taking us through a bit more around the convention and the connections with the COP. Actually, one of the main things I think we should focus is actually how COP30 could really, address those structural barriers, as you were talking about, in terms of the access for climate finance and the unfair global tax rules, but also other enablers like cost of capital. And that's where I think it's really important for us to go back to the conversation on debt, which was held within a 54, which was present, of course, with around the annuals, but also the debt conversation in the G20 will be quite an important one, with direct impacts on the climate finance conversation, and that will be happening at the very end of the negotiations in Belém, in South Africa, around later in November. For that, I would like to invite Yolanda Fresnillo from Eurodat also to share a few reflections. Yolanda, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot for the very good insights on what happened at the 50, at the annuals and the tax convention negotiations. I think it's good to have this overview as a whole, because we usually touch these spaces in silos, and they are really interconnected. And one of these spaces is the G20 as well. The G20 has its own non-inclusive dynamic, I would say. Obviously, it's getting bigger, as we know, with the African Union being invited last year to be part of it, and sometimes it feels it's a little bit more representative of Global South voices, like last year and this year with the Brazil first and now South African presidency of the G20. But I think the structure and the structural deficiencies of the G20 make themselves evident, or even more evident, when a Global South country presides and leads on it, and that is one of the issues where this becomes very evident. I'm going to explain why I'm saying this now. So this year, the South African presidency wanted to have debt as one of the main issues in their agenda for the G20 presidency, and they really expressed the need for the G20 to deliver advances to address the debt problems, particularly in Africa. And what we heard is that they were planning to issue a debt declaration at the time of the annual meetings on debt. What we were told is not expect something very ambitious because it's the G20. And indeed, this is what happened. They issued a declaration. The only news there is that there is a declaration on debt. The content of this declaration is basically, and I think the language is really telling, because all it repeats is we continue supporting, we reaffirm. It's this kind of language saying the same we've been doing in the last 2 years, or 3 years, which is the common framework, is what we will keep doing. There's very little novelty in the declaration in terms of advances on solutions for Global South countries in debt crisis. There's a slight proposal of exploring climate and other debt payments pause clauses, but no commitment at all, just like, let's explore this together. And I think this lack of ambition and lack of advancement in proposals, even to incorporate slight reforms at the common framework, because there have been proposals to improve the common framework, which is very limited, to expand it to middle-income countries, to incorporate the payments suspension, so not cancellation, but just suspension of the payments while there is a debt restructuring. These are very minimal proposals. This is not accepted. This is, I mean, it was not in the declaration. So I think what this declaration tells us is that the G20 is unfit to address the debt problems, the same that it is unfit to address the climate problems, because its undemocratic and non-inclusive nature means that it's still the most powerful, the US, China as well, Europe, that are the ones making all the decisions. Even if there is a South African presidency, even if there is a Brazilian presidency, it becomes impossible for these countries to make the G20 agenda advance towards a more progressive agenda, because it is still, again, a non-democratic space dominated by the most powerful and reflecting the interests of the capital, of the private interests in those countries, in the US, in Europe, and the interests of China, for instance, as a big lender. There was a joint action on a letter to the South African presidency. I can post the letter that we sent here, calling for more ambitious proposals. Let's see what happens in the G20 Leaders Summit now in November, right after the COP. I don't think we can expect anything substantial coming out of this space. Also understanding that next year there's a US presidency, which is even worse, and words are that what the US is planning is to undermine the G20 and reduce the agenda to a minimum. Let's see what happens there. We also heard that there might be some action from the African Union side on debt vis-a-vis the G20 presidency at the President's Summit in November. Let's see if that happens, with an alternative narrative on what is needed on debt. I'm afraid I cannot bring in information on the climate elements of the G20, because I'm focusing on the debt one. But I think that the same, as I said before, the same stands for climate. It is not the right space to advance the climate agenda, because it is dominated by countries like the US, for instance, which is never going to accept any substantial agreement at the G20 level on climate, for instance. I'll leave it there. I know this has been more like a narrative than a specific information, but I'll post the link to the letter, to the joint letter, and the Eurodat reaction to this G20 debt declaration.
Thank you so much, Yolanda, for those reflections. And I guess the lack of ambition and the inadequacy of all those different forms, especially when we really need is to drive the debt agenda in a more democratic way and outside the spaces, is really key. But when we look at the UNFCCC, it is a space where actually you have all countries represented, and so the scope on that is not present there, of course. I guess it's really urgent to increase connecting the dots more and more. And I think, as Marcus mentioned, there are different avenues to do that. So COP30 is happening in Brazil, not so much as a finance COP. The finance COP was last year in Azerbaijan, COP29, when the new climate goal was established, the NCQG, which is highly inadequate. But that leaves COP30 negotiations this year with more questions than answers, especially as they also connected with all these other forums and conversations. So for that, Rebecca, it would be great to hear your reflections. So what we can expect and how can we drive that conversation forward in terms of international financial institutions and COP. Thanks.
Thanks, Mariana, and thanks everyone. Good to be here and really great to hear from colleagues before me. I'll try to connect a bit with what has been shared before and bring that to the COP conversation. So first, I think we have to remind ourselves that COPs are not happening in silos, and they are very much connected to the external context that we are facing right now, that is pretty, turbulent. And as you were saying, Mariana, earlier, like the geopolitical situation is unprecedented. So it has implication on the COP beyond the kind of formal negotiating tracks. So between, conflicts across the globe, commercial wars, retreat of international solidarity, all those elements are influencing very much the expectation we can have towards this COP. But the context within the UNFCCC itself and within the COP is also a very particular one. We are 10 years after Paris. I don't know if some of you follow the latest NDC synthesis report, which is what the UN published usually on the NDC year. Countries have to submit their climate plans, and so the Secretariat bring all those plans together to have kind of an evaluation of where we stand in terms of ambition and how are we on the route towards 1.5 degree Celsius objective. And of course, the results were expected to be very low, and unsurprisingly, they were. Mindful that not all the plans have been submitted, so we still miss big players such as the EU, China, India. But I think one of the messaging coming from the synthesis report from yesterday or the day before is that without adequate finance, we're not going to get where we need to be in terms of the Paris Agreement objective. If you look at the developing country plans and the conditional elements within those plans, which means that they say we can achieve this level of ambition, it's not a matter of that we lack of vision, we have the vision, but we lack of resources. And so this part of the plan is conditional to the support we will receive. And I think that's a very important contextual element for this COP.
Sorry, Rebecca, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I can't hear you. I don't know if it's just me. Oh, back. Sorry.
I'm back? Okay.
Yes.
Should I turn my camera off? Is it the connection issue? Okay.
No, it's good. Please continue.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sorry about that. So the ambition gap, what we call the ambition gap, has to be read in the context of the finance gap as well. And hoping that the finance conversation was closed last year is at best naive. Then we have also, and I think that's connecting to the conversation that we were having before me, the role of private finance, being propelled as the solution to close the finance gap, to close the climate finance gap as well, is really worrying. And so not only we have to be reactive to those propositions, but actually really making sure we reclaim the solution we've been advocating for many years, starting with public grant-based finance. Another thing is the reality that we are in the unmet promises from developed countries to fulfill their obligation in the first place. We can talk about new goals, new objectives, but we should actually start with making sure previous goals are met, and we are far from being there. Is my sound still okay, Mariana? I see your face. Okay. So that's, I think, in terms of mistrust, something that's very important to factor in when we enter this COP. So that being said, maybe a last element of context for those of you following from far or from close. I think we can also really feel that the Brazilians are betting a lot on the informality around this COP. So not specifically focusing on what can be achieved in the formal negotiating tracks and trying to put their weight there, but actually, proposing a lot of initiative, coalitions, etc., that's under the umbrella of the action agenda. And you remember in the FFD4 negotiation, we had the Sevilla platform of action. It's exactly the same attempt, divert the conversation from formal tracks to informal conversation that, of course, requires much less accountability and responsibility. within that context, the question you asked, Mariana, is what can the COP do? And I think there are three main things when it comes to finance and the financial architecture reform that the COP can do. One is to create a dedicated space for public finance. Two is to get the accountability framework right. And three is to connect the dots with other processes. And then I have a bonus for the end of my presentation. So one, creating the space for public finance. The reason why we are saying this must be a priority is because we talked about the NCQG decision a lot, so the new climate finance goal that was adopted in Baku. And one of the things this new goal sets as precedent is the dilution of historical responsibilities. So it's much more complicated for us to advocate for more public finance within this new framework, within this new goal. So we have to find ways to resituate the public finance conversation at the core of the finance negotiations. So the G77 has been proposing to have a specific agenda item on that topic. So we'll see if that works or not. We can expect a lot of pushback, obviously, from developed countries that do everything they can to avoid discussing public finance and focusing more on MDBs, on private finance. But the real question is, how can we make sure that public provision moving forward would be predictable, would be accessible, and would be grant-based, obviously. And that's directly linked, of course, with the debt conversation, because if we don't secure a clear portion of grants for mitigation, for adaptation, for loss and damage, we will just perpetuate the debt virtuous circle we are in, knowing that 70% of climate finance is now disbursed through loans. And the majority of that is not concessional. I think that's very important to know. And even if you look at the most vulnerable, SIDS and LDC, so small island states and least developed countries, 50% of the finance they receive is given through loans. So the loan issue and the debt-inducing instruments is a very serious one that we cannot let go of. Secondly, beyond guaranteeing adequate and enough finance is delivered, we also have to make sure we can monitor it, right? We can track and make sure those who are responsible to provide it are held accountable. And so we also need to make sure the framework for accountability is put in place. So that starts with some very old battle we've been fighting for, but that's still not resolved, and some new issues that came with the NCQG decision. So one very old battle we've been talking about for years and years is the question of the definition of climate finance. It may sound silly, we are in 2025 and we thought, oh, maybe we are clear about what climate finance is. We're not. And let me tell you, it's not a coincidence, right? It's a political choice to make this definition blurry. Because then when you don't know what climate finance is, you can basically account anything under the sink as climate finance. And of course, contributing countries have been nourishing this kind of opacity. The question of how do we count concessionality, the methodology for grants equivalency may sound very technical, but are actually essential to make sure we advance towards more grant-based and not then inducing climate finance. The tracking of private finance mobilized is also very important because developed countries have been talking a lot about, the miracle of private finance, but we haven't yet agreed exactly on the methodology to track this finance that is expected to deliver so much. So we know from fact that it's not delivering so much, but we still need to put a clear framework on how to count for this type of finance. Then John raised the question of the role of MDBs and MDBs climate finance. So since the NCQG decision, they are now portrayed as the new actor to channel climate finance, but we don't have a methodology to account for their outflows moving forward. So that's, of course, a big gap, right? You can't be calling them for taking more space without making sure we actually account for qualitative climate finance. Finally, connecting the dots, I won't be too long on that because I think we heard a lot about those different processes by previous speakers. Daniela told us about the different FFD4 outcomes. Marcus made the link really clear between Nairobi and Belém. But so it's just very important that the UNFCCC, the COP30, stays alive to those other processes and stop considering the climate finance conversation as being treated in silos, right? And as if the COP were the only space and the only body that could actually tackle this conversation. We have to use the convening power of the COP to bring those different actors and those different processes at the table to discuss collectively what is climate finance about, what are the external barriers we have that makes it very hard for developing countries to access and scale up this climate finance. And of course, the question of debt is coming up very strongly in that context, as well as the question of tax, illicit financial flows, but also progressive environmental taxation. And as Marcus said, there are different processes that we could look at in the context of COP30 that could be beneficial to really raise attention and emphasize the need to connect the dots between COP and international finance architecture elements. Finally, the bonus, and then I'll stop here. You may have heard from me or from other colleagues that the big focus this year is on just transition, and it has everything to do with what we've been discussing until now. I focus my presentation on climate finance because I think there are technical elements that are really connected to what colleagues have been said, but maybe on a more higher level. I think we have a political responsibility as civil society this year to make sure we are not falling into the trap of making climate action unjust. And that's what has been done so far, 10 years after the Paris Agreement. One of the reasons we are seeing so much climate backlash across the board is, of course, because of climate skepticism and Trump being the first one in that field, because of the rise of fascism and populism, but also because people are seeing climate action as unjust, right? And so we have, I think, a really important role to play to show that there are solutions that work for people, for communities, for workers, right? And through the Just Transition Work Program this year, we have this opportunity. It has everything to do with finance. It has everything to do with debt. But the narrative has to be, we ground the climate conversation through real life, real economy, and real challenges people face. So I really also call us to have an eye on this specific track and together work for this signal to be sent at the end of the COP to make the legacy of Belém about social justice and climate justice more than anything else. Thanks, Marianne. I'll stop here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rebecca, and for all the panelists for this really rich discussion. Now we're going to pass into the Q&A. And yeah, please, everyone, include your questions on the Q&A box. I actually would like to start with a question by Kate Tobin. So she's asking, if the Bretton Woods institutions aren't doing what you want in terms of climate, or much else actually, is it really a loss if they step back? I guess in a normative sense, but necessarily in a financing sense, as climate should be in the form of grants and not loans. So is it a lesser or two evils a strategy for us? Okay, Yolanda, please, over to you.
I think Kate pointed the key question, because I think civil society has been debating about this for quite a long time. My view is that Bretton Woods institutions, I mean, they exist and they are lending today. And this means that they need to consider climate. And what I'm not saying is that we should push for them to increase their influence in the climate finance sphere, because that's, as Kate says, it's mostly in the form of loans. In the case of the World Bank, most of it is in the form of non-concessional loans, so almost at market interest rates. So that's the worst kind of financing you can have. But the extreme, the other extreme is to not consider climate at all, meaning increasing fossil fuel financing, for instance. So I think our push for them is you cannot ignore the climate emergency. It needs to be incorporated in your policies, because they are doing these policies today. For me, it's a similar position on gender. It's not that we're calling them to be gender leaders, gender policy leaders, because they will get it wrong, as they get wrong climate, because they focus mostly on lending, on market-based solutions, on green conditionalities, as John was saying, so they get it wrong. But as civil society, we need to name and shame and to put evidence on what they are doing wrong, how they are getting climate wrong, and how climate should be incorporated in their policies. One example is that sustainability assessment. So the IMF and the World Bank evaluate how debt is sustainable or not sustainable in each country in the world. And they are slightly incorporating climate perspectives in there, but they are not doing it right. And obviously, climate is a huge element of that sustainability from our perspective. So obviously, it needs to be incorporated. That doesn't mean that we want the IMF and the World Bank to be the ones or the only ones that deliver on that sustainability analysis. We think that sustainability analysis should be done by an independent body. But while they are doing those, they need to consider climate, and not only climate risks, but the needs for climate finance, etc. So I don't know. It's a nuanced answer, but I think it's a shared position by many in these spaces.
Yeah. Thank you. Absolutely. Rebecca, please come in.
Yeah, no, I just want to second everything Yolanda just said. And in the context of COP30 specifically, there is what was already mentioned, the Article 2.1c, which is about making financial flow consistent with the Paris Agreement. And the way we read this article, because there are many ways to read it, and interpretation are very different depending on who you talk to, but the way we've been looking at it is also a way to actually bring those actors along and make sure they also commit to implement policies and measures that are aligned with the Paris Agreement, meaning, of course, reducing emissions and harmful flows, but also aligning with equity and justice. And so I think it's important to be nuanced. We don't want them to take the lead, but we do want them to comply with important standards that are embedded in the Paris Agreement. And the other thing I wanted to add is, of course, we have this big MDBs push, and I think we now said how we see it and how we want to approach it. But we also need to remind ourselves that there is a real alternative to those MDBs, which are the UNFCCC climate funds. So think about the Green Climate Fund, the very recent Loss and Damage Fund, or the Fund to Respond to Loss and Damage, if I have to be precise, the Adaptation Fund. All those funds, of course, have their caveats, and there are some issues with them, but they have the real added value to be democratic. At least they have a balanced governing body between developed and developing countries, and often developing countries actually have more power in those structures. They also have the mandate to provide qualitative finance, and they are much more transparent and accountable. So I think MDBs now have kind of a trend, developed countries, of course, prefer to use them because they have more ownership and they control them more. But for many, many years, the climate finance landscape has been relying on those very important funds. And we cannot forget that they are part of the finance conversation. And just to close, the NCQG decision, within all the very bad things that it has decided on, has one paragraph that's calling to triple the outflows of those specific funds. And we can be sure that developed countries would do everything they can to ignore that paragraph. So it's again our job to make sure they remind that they have also signed to that specific section, and they have to commit to implement and scale up through those funds as well.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca and Yolanda. We have also a question from David Archer from in the chat. So he's asking, the links between work on just transition and climate finance is key, and much depends on understanding of what the just transition means. There are compelling arguments that transition cannot be just without comprehensive investments in public services. Is this accepted? Then the scale of climate finance needed to achieve a just transition needs significant scaling up. And there are links to pushing back on IMF austerity policies and on the impact of the debt crisis. How do panelists see these connections? Who would like to come in?
Do you want me to start, Yolanda, or do you want to come in first? No, I mean, definitely, David. I think that's one of the main observation we've been doing through this just transition campaign is that or escalation or big push around just transition is that the just transition concept has been captured by many different actors, including MDBs, by the way. They do have just transition principle. So we have a job as well to clarify what we mean by just transition, as you were saying in your comment. Because otherwise we can end up with instruments or projects such as the JET-Peace, right? The Just Transition Energy Partnership, that has nothing to do with just transition the way we understand it, because it's about privatization of industries, it's about giving more loans to countries and push them in this debt circle, etc., etc. So maybe to answer more concretely, there are 3 things we think need to happen in COP in the context of the Just Transition Work Program to counter this kind of capture of the just transition concept. One is to recognize that just transition finance is specific and additional and covers specific needs that are public. So it has to be recognized by the COP that, for example, social protection schemes, economic diversification, ecosystem restoration are not mitigation, are not adaptation, are not loss and damage, but are purely just transition policies and measures that required adequate and additional public finance. That's one thing that I think that would help us to, put one foot in the door and help us to finance just transition at scale moving forward. The second thing is to recognize that just transition requires qualitative finance. The good thing about that is in the current text of the Just Transition Work Program that we got in Bonn, there are 4 paragraphs on finance so far that are really about non-debt inducing instruments, qualitative public finance linked to just transition, etc., etc. We know that they're not going to survive, that's quite sure, but we have to fight to at least keep the concept in there. Maybe not through 4 paragraphs, that's really a luxury situation, but at least one. And finally, one of the main asks we have for just transition this year is to have what we call a BELEM action mechanism, the BAM, to have another acronym in the series. And one of the things this BAM could do is actually really emphasize and elevate from very concrete example, what are the structural obstacles and barriers within the economic system that are hindering the just transition to happen. So what is the role of the cost of capital, for example, and why developed countries can't access qualitative, quantitative money because of that? What is the role of austerity and debt, and how does that affect the just transition in the global south? All those things would need to be elevated and discussed through this new mechanism. So I think with those 3 elements, hopefully we can recenter the justice part of just transition.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Yolanda, do you want to complement?
Yeah, just on very, very shortly on something that David mentioned in his comment or a question, is on pushing back on austerity policies. And it's not just pushing back on austerity policies. I mean, the IMF and the World Bank keep denying that there is a debt crisis because they don't see a series of defaults. And countries are not defaulting because they are cutting their expenses, including investments in just transition. It is impossible to scale up investments in just transition, so investments from the public for the public needs and benefit on just transition, if the main priority of the government is how to survive to debt and how to repay the debt. So unless we find a way to push for debt cancellation and reducing those debt levels, it is impossible for countries to do so. So even when the IMF is not explicitly conditioning, so imposing conditionalities on austerity, and they are doing that, but even when there is no conditionality, countries are cutting the possibilities of investing in just transition because of the high debt levels. So it is very important to address the debt crisis as a development crisis, but also as a climate crisis and as an obstacle to advance in this just transition.
Daniela, please come in.
Thank you. Just I completely agree with Rebecca and Yolanda. Just to add one thing, and I want to emphasize on what Yolanda said. There is not a recognition of debt crisis, but by debt, they recognize that we are facing high debt levels and high debt vulnerabilities. And the answer from the IFIs to this context is austerity. And of course, we know this means less investment for public services and for climate. But I want to link this with what Yolanda was mentioning in the first question regarding the sustainability analysis. That's why we need to include in an adequate manner climate financing needs. And we need, yes, to share the exact concept on just transition, but also on what is sustainable, what is a sustainable debt. A debt cannot be considered sustainable at the expense of falling or failing to guarantee human and environmental rights. So that's why we need to understand both concepts jointly, and that's why we need new debt sustainability analysis, not the ones we have right now from the IMF, that also, as Yolanda was saying, define the debt relief needs and other things that can be helpful to countries that are highly vulnerable to climate crisis.
Great, thank you. I have a question actually, just some of when we were discussing on terms of the whole narrative of MDBs, and to some extent we touched on all those like false finance solutions in terms of private sector first, because the overall narrative is that there is not enough money. But when we know that in fact it is, the main issue is political will. So and especially when you think about how to increase the fiscal space, we go back to the conversation on taxation. We know that in FFD3 in Addis, the main issue then was the fight for a UN tax body, which wasn't accomplished there. But years later was when the African Group of Negotiations passed a resolution which originated the UN Tax Convention. So I'm just wondering, in terms of narrative, Marcus, to what extent not only looking at all the things you noted in terms of addressing tax dodging, different elements, but how to really, the convention can help to increase that conversation on other forms of taxation, and how we can bring this back to the conversation of fiscal space and what Rebecca was mentioning in terms of COP. It would be great to hear a bit more from you on that.
Mariana, you mentioned the Addis Ababa, right? At this time, the tax convention was already desired, but it was turned down, right? So I think this is already a development, and it was driven by the Africa Group throughout 2022 to finally have such a process, right? To take the tax rules out of the hands of the OECD and put it under the United Nations roof and EGID. So I think this is definitely here the significant and important development to constate, right? So from this point of view, I think when it comes to taxation and international tax rules, this first step has been made. And this comes very much with a recognition that there is enough money in the world. We are seeing rising inequalities, the richer getting richer. We know that from a certain wealth, you pay less taxes because you can afford to construct systems which allow you not to pay taxes. We know as well, everybody knows that Starbucks is paying less taxes than your baker around the corner, right? So I think as well there is a certain recognition on this inherent injustices in the current tax rules. We are at the beginning of the process. It is not the end is open still, right? We have still 1.5 years to negotiate. We know the frontiers as well, in particular when it comes to a more progressive environmental taxation. This is the big autocracies, this is the petrostates. So I think there is this historic opportunity to overcome existing tax rules. There are a majority of member states behind it, and even more, I think what very important for me, what our debate and the topic of our webinar shows today, right? We're having a climate and debt topic. We are looking at the global financial architecture in the context of climate finance, right? So the idea of having an integrated view of drivers, of barriers, is as well, in a way, triggering down to us, to our communities, to the honorable participants of our webinar today. And I think this is the good way and is the way to go, and we have to continue.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, I think these were the end of our questions. Just would like to hear a few final reflections from our panel as we continue the conversation forward. Daniela, over to you.
Sure, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists that gave a very insightful conversation for me. I would like to highlight maybe 3 things to close. The first one would be that we need to do things at the same time. For the one hand, we need to prevent superficial solutions that benefit only private interests from being promoted, but also to advocate for what is truly necessary. And I think that is really difficult when the space given to the large companies in international fora is much greater than the space given to civil society or the voices from the ground, right? So how to change that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. The other challenge I find is that I think we need to ask ourselves how we want to change the system if those who make the decisions remain in the same power state. So I know COP perhaps is more democratic in some way, or FFD, but those spaces are not I am thinking on financing terms, and those spaces, I don't know why they are not delivering the solutions we need. And I am thinking on debt. IFIs and G20 and G7 are continue to holding this power and the decision making. So that's why it's important to move towards a more democratic governance. And the third one would be a challenge that was not mentioned, but I think we have to have that in mind, is not the same representatives of countries are part of the negotiations in the different processes. I don't know, ministers of finance, ministers of environment, I don't know. So that's why we need to advocate in a comprehensive manner towards our authorities, not only the ones that participate, but the whole of them. And I think that's why important this space, because we are connecting the different global spaces, and why it's important to as the panelist was saying, connecting the dots, mainly focusing on climate, that for me is one of the more urgent issues if we want to have a safe and healthy planet for all of us. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Daniela. Yolanda, over to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, subscribing everything that Daniela just said. I think the way to go is what this webinar did, which is not looking at our specific silos, but working on an overview of what are the different spaces that exist, and try to influence those spaces on these interlinked issues, debt and climate being one, but also tax. But also focusing on what are the solutions, the structural solutions that we want, and don't forget that horizon, because if we only concentrate in the small fixes that we can get in the G20 or here or there, there's no way forward. And I think that the tax convention is an example of how persisting on our solutions can deliver. So I think on debt and on climate, on the debt and climate interlinks, we need to do that. Just a very small comment, because we haven't mentioned it, but these days I'm looking at what's happening in Jamaica and what is happening in Cuba, in Haiti, in other Caribbean countries with Hurricane Melissa, and how the structures that we have are so inadequate and insufficient for these countries. So we're not talking in abstract. We're talking about a country that has been devastated, Jamaica, that has had debt problems for a long time, that is presented as the example to follow, how it has reduced debt. It has reduced debt through a very harsh and long austerity. This is the way Jamaica has reduced debt. And now it's going to be indebted again because it doesn't have, there are no debt-free finance proposals and tools for Jamaica, because it's a upper middle income country, which is crazy, absolutely. There's no debt relief for Jamaica. And Jamaica will have to keep paying their debts in the following months, even when the absolute need is going to be survival and reconstruction. So this is how the world is really wrong, and how the small fixes and the market-based solutions are not going to solve. And look at this country today, many other countries in many other occasions. But I think if we think of Jamaica these days, the way to go is these structural reforms that Daniela was referring to. Thank you.
Absolutely, Yolanda. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that's one key example of how the system is not working. Let's hear then from Marcus and then Rebecca.
I just actually wanted to, of course, echoing what Daniela said about the interconnectedness. But I want to thank you, Mariana, and my dear co-panelists for really adding the pieces to the puzzle as well. Thank you for the dear colleagues behind the screen organizing it. And most of all, I would like to thank and encourage the participants who came with a curiosity of what is the link between climate and debt. And I hope really that this interest continues, and that there is not a barrier about the points we want to make, that it is indeed a systemic view. It is not anymore about a certain renewable energy capacity installed or greenhouse gas emissions, but it's really to look at the economic drivers from different directions. So I really encourage you to continue being interested about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus and Rebecca.
Yeah, no, I don't have much to add. Thanks, Yolanda, Daniela, Marcus, for the closing remarks. Maybe just one thought I think we are all struggling with when it comes to, organizing our power, doing advocacy, doing campaigning, is thinking ahead, right? Thinking long term and not letting ourselves go from one summit to another and always be in that kind of reactive position. But as Yolanda said, we have the solution. We have kind of our moral compass clear. So it's up to us also to maybe be more proactive about it and plan ahead already and plant the seeds to win on the midterm, long term. Of course, the context is very negative. We talked about it. We are seeing very opposing forces coming to us, but we also have, I think, more and more the ability to converge and to build those bridges in a much more structured manner than I think we were before. And the FFD4 experience was maybe also very useful for that. We managed to build bridges across different thematics, different pillars of financing for development that help us to be stronger and more organized. But this has to continue. And I think we have also to look, beyond just a COP or just one G20 summit, but already really thinking, what are we going to achieve in 2030? What are we going to achieve in 2035 to make sure we sustain our power for the long term? So I'll just close on that. Thanks, Mariana.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rebecca, and all the panelists. Thank you all everyone who participated today in this webinar, and continue to work together, breaking the silos and doing cross movement campaigning, advocacy, lobbying, communication is something we'll continue to focus on. Just wanted to plug in, this is the first webinar of a series of 2. As COP approaches, one of the key things we need to fight are the false finance solutions. So next Wednesday, the 5th of November at 2 o'clock UTC, we'll have a webinar exposing false and distracting finance solutions, where a number of mini briefings will be published. I'm putting in the webinar, there is the link to register, but also published around. So thank you all so much for coming, and la luta continua. Thanks all, have a good day.